They say the screams could be heard across the valley. The boy is 12 years old. His back is already striped with scars from previous beatings, but today is different. Today is the diamastigosis, the whipping ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Blood runs down his spine in rivulets, soaking into the white stone beneath him. His face is locked in a rictus of agony, every muscle straining not to make a sound. The Spartan citizens watch, judging. The ones who scream fail. The ones who die silent are celebrated. Some boys don't survive. Their bodies are carried away and their names are never spoken again. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't ancient propaganda. This happened, documented by multiple sources, for centuries. And this ritual, this public torture of children, was just one element in a 13-year program that began when boys were 7 years old. Systematic starvation to teach resourcefulness. Public beatings for entertainment. Forced combat between children until bones broke. Sleep deprivation. Exposure to freezing temperatures without adequate clothing. Older boys given absolute authority over younger ones, creating a hierarchy where victims became perpetrators, where abuse flowed downward through generations. We've spent 2,500 years calling this warrior culture. Movies like 300 turn it into heroic fantasy. Military academies study it as the pinnacle of discipline. Spartan warrior is one of the highest compliments you can give someone, but Plutarch documented it, Xenophon witnessed it, Aristotle condemned it, and when you read what ancient sources actually describe, not the sanitized versions in history textbooks, but the original accounts, you're looking at state-mandated child abuse on a civilizational scale. Strip away the mythology, and the Agoge was institutionalized torture masquerading as education. Let me show you what really happened when Sparta took a 7-year-old boy from his mother. Every detail comes from primary sources. Every horror is documented. This is the Agoge. But before we get to age 7, we need to start at birth. Because the abuse didn't begin when boys entered the system. It began the moment they took their first breath. You're born in Sparta around 450 BCE. Within hours of your birth, you're taken from your mother, not to be weighed or measured, but to be inspected. A council of tribal elders examines you under torchlight. They're looking for deformities, weakness, any sign that you might not become a perfect warrior. The criteria are arbitrary and brutal. Too small? Rejected. Limbs not proportionate? Rejected. Crying too much? That might be weakness. If you fail the inspection, you're carried to a place called the Apothete, a chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. You're left there to die of exposure. No burial, no mourning. You simply cease to exist in Spartan record. Modern excavations of the area have found scattered bones, tiny bones. The Spartans weren't exaggerating about this practice. They really did expose infants they deemed unworthy. This wasn't a rare occurrence. Plutarch describes it as routine procedure. Every Spartan newborn underwent this inspection. The society that prided itself on creating the strongest warriors began by murdering its weakest babies. Let's say you pass. You're brought back to your mother. For the next 7 years, you live a relatively normal childhood by ancient standards. You play. You bond with your family. You develop a sense of safety, of belonging, of being loved. The Spartans designed it this way deliberately. They wanted you to have something to lose. Age 7 arrives. There's no ceremony, no preparation, no explanation. One day, men come to your home. Your mother has known this day was coming since your birth, but she's forbidden from showing emotion. To cry, to beg, to try to hold on to you, that would mark her as weak, potentially subject her to public humiliation. So she watches in silence as these strangers take you. Modern psychologists have a term for what happens to a child's brain during traumatic separation at this developmental stage: attachment disruption. The neural pathways that govern trust, security, and emotional regulation are still forming at age 7. Violent separation from primary caregivers literally rewires the developing brain, often permanently. The Spartans didn't know the neuroscience. But they understood the effect. They wanted to break your attachment to family and replace it with attachment to the state. You're not alone. Dozens of other 7-year-old boys are being collected across Sparta on the same day. You're herded together. That's the right word. Herded, like livestock, and marched to the training grounds outside the city. The barracks are stone buildings with minimal furnishings, 60 to 70 boys per room. No privacy, no comfort, no way out. Your head is shaved, you're stripped of your home clothes and given a single red cloak. That's your entire wardrobe for the year. One cloak, no tunic underneath, no shoes, no undergarments, just a rough woolen cloak that will have to suffice in summer heat and winter cold. Then you meet the Paidonomos. This is the man who will control your life for the next 13 years. The word translates roughly as boy herder, but that doesn't capture the reality. He's your warden, your judge, your torturer. He has absolute authority over you. He can beat you whenever he wants, for whatever reason he chooses, or for no reason at all. Plutarch describes the Paidonomos as the most disciplined of the citizens. What he means is the cruelest, the most willing to inflict suffering, the most committed to the system. Within 24 hours of arrival, every new boy receives his first beating. Not for breaking rules, you haven't had time to learn the rules yet. The beating serves a different purpose, establishing dominance, showing you that your body is no longer yours, teaching you that pain is the fundamental language of this place. You're 7 years old, you've just been torn from everything familiar, and now a grown man is hitting you with a stick while other boys watch. Some boys cry. They're beaten harder. The lesson is clear. Emotion is weakness, and weakness will be punished until you learn to suppress it entirely. But the physical beating is just the introduction. The real torture is more systematic. Sleep deprivation begins immediately. You're woken before dawn. The exact hour varies, but ancient sources suggest around 4 or 5 a.m., and driven into the courtyard for physical training. Running, wrestling, more running. The exercises continue until you're exhausted. But you're not allowed to sleep. After physical training comes education, reading, writing, music, memorizing Spartan laws and poetry. Your mind is foggy from exhaustion, but if you doze off during lessons, you're beaten awake. Lunch is minimal, dinner is worse, and this is where the true genius of Spartan cruelty reveals itself. The mess system, the syssitia, was documented extensively by Xenophon, who visited Sparta and observed it firsthand. Here's how it worked. You're assigned to a communal dining group with your age cohort. You eat together, sleep in the same room together, train together. The Spartans understood that isolation is easier to resist than watching your peers suffer alongside you. Group trauma creates group compliance. Every evening, you're marched to the mess hall, long wooden tables, benches, the smell of food, which becomes the smell of disappointment. The portions are deliberately insufficient. Not small, but adequate. Insufficient. You're fed just enough to keep you alive and functional, but never enough to feel satisfied. Growing boys, subjected to intense physical training all day, need substantial calories. You're getting maybe half of what your body requires. And the food itself? Plutarch describes the infamous black broth, a soup made from pork, blood, salt and vinegar. Foreign visitors who tasted it said they finally understood why Spartans weren't afraid to die in battle. Death would be preferable to eating that soup for the rest of your life. But you eat it. You eat every drop, because it's all you're getting. Here's the purpose, stated explicitly in Spartan educational philosophy preserved by Plutarch. Hunger teaches resourcefulness. What they mean is hunger forces you to steal. The boys who survive the Agoge aren't the strongest or the fastest. They're the ones who learn to steal food without getting caught. Every boy in the system understands this. You're expected to steal, encouraged to steal. Your survival depends on stealing. From storage rooms, from kitchens, from neighboring farms, from anywhere you can find food. But, and this is the crucial twist, if you're caught stealing, you're beaten savagely, not for the theft itself, for being incompetent enough to get caught. Plutarch records a famous story that illustrates the system perfectly. A boy stole a fox. Why a fox? Probably to eat it, and hid it under his cloak. While standing in formation, the fox began gnawing through his stomach. The boy stood silent, letting the animal eat through his flesh, until he collapsed dead. Rather than reveal the theft and face punishment for being caught, he chose death. Whether this specific incident happened exactly as described is debatable. But it's telling that Spartans told this story as an example of admirable behavior. The boy who let himself be eaten alive rather than admit failure, that's the ideal they were teaching. Think about what this does to a child's moral development. You're 7, 8, 9 years old. Your brain is learning how the world works, developing ethical frameworks, understanding right and wrong. And the lesson you're being taught is, stealing is mandatory, but competence matters more than morality. Success through deception is virtue. Getting caught is the only real crime. Modern psychologists call this moral injury, forcing someone to violate their own ethical beliefs until those beliefs shatter entirely. It's a technique used in cult indoctrination, military hazing rituals, and authoritarian regimes. The Spartans perfected it 2,500 years ago. You learn quickly. The first few weeks you're hungry all the time, your stomach cramps. You can't focus during training. Some boys faint from malnutrition, but gradually you adapt. You learn which kitchens are less guarded. You learn how to move silently. You learn how to lie convincingly when questioned. You learn that your fellow trainees are both allies and competition. You might steal together, but you'll betray each other in a heartbeat if it means avoiding punishment. And if you don't learn, if you're not clever or fast or ruthless enough to steal successfully, you starve. Not to death, the Paidonomos won't let you die that easily. But you become weak, a target, and in a system where older boys have absolute authority over younger ones, being weak makes you prey. We'll get to that hierarchy soon. But first, let me show you what the first few months in the Agoge do to a child's mind. You're 7 years old. You've been separated from your family. You're sleeping on beds you made yourself from river reeds. Rough, uncomfortable, infested with insects. You're wearing one thin cloak in all weather. You're perpetually hungry. You're beaten regularly for infractions you don't fully understand. You're surrounded by 60 other terrified boys who are just as desperate and frightened as you are. And you're learning the most important lesson of all. Trust no one. Trust gets you betrayed. Weakness gets you beaten. Emotion gets you punished. The only way to survive is to become hard, cold, and ruthlessly self-interested. Some boys adapt quickly. They're the ones who become the next generation of abusers. The 14-year-olds beating 10-year-olds, the 18-year-olds tormenting everyone below them. Some boys break. They become shadows, moving through the system in a dissociative fog, functionally destroyed but physically alive. And some boys, not many but some, maintain a small spark of humanity. They form quiet bonds with other boys. They share stolen food. They help each other survive. The system tries to crush these bonds, because compassion is dangerous to the Agoge's purpose. If you care about your fellow trainees, you might hesitate to betray them. You might refuse to hurt them when ordered. You might retain some capacity for empathy. And empathy was the enemy of everything Sparta was trying to create. But we're still only months into the system. You're 7, maybe 8 years old now. You've learned to steal. You've learned to suppress emotion. You've learned that pain is constant and mercy is non-existent. What you don't know yet, what you can't possibly understand, is that this is just the foundation. The physical deprivation, the hunger, the beatings, these are just preparing you for something worse. Something that reveals the true psychological architecture of the Agoge. Because the Spartans had refined something far more insidious than simple cruelty. They'd created a system where the victims became the perpetrators, where abuse flowed downward through generations of boys, each one traumatized into traumatizing the next. And at age 8 or 9, you're about to meet the boys who will show you exactly what you'll become. The Irenes are coming. The Irenes arrive when you're about 8 or 9 years old. Not to help you, to own you. These are boys, technically young men, aged 18 to 20. They've survived the Agoge. They've endured everything you're enduring now. They've been beaten, starved, and broken for over a decade. And now, as a reward for their survival, The Spartan state gives them absolute authority over you. Not supervision, not mentorship, authority. They can beat you whenever they want, for any reason or for no reason at all, and they're explicitly encouraged to be brutal. Plutarch documents this system with disturbing clarity. The Irenes were given whips and told to use them liberally. They were instructed to create a climate of fear. The justification was that younger boys needed to learn obedience through pain, that respect came through terror, that submission had to be beaten into flesh. But here's what Plutarch doesn't fully articulate, probably because it was so obvious to ancient readers it didn't need explanation. This wasn't about education. It was about creating a self-perpetuating cycle of trauma. You're 9 years old. The 14-year-old beating you today was beaten when he was 9. The 18-year-old supervising your beating was that 14-year-old. And in 5 years you'll be 14 and you'll have younger boys to beat. Every victim becomes a perpetrator. Every generation traumatizes the next. The system doesn't break, it replicates. Modern psychology has extensively studied this phenomenon. It appears in prison systems, in abusive organizations, in cults. But we didn't invent it. Sparta perfected it 2,500 years ago. The Stanford prison experiment in 1971 demonstrated how quickly normal people will abuse authority over others when given permission and opportunity. Psychology professor Philip Zimbardo had to shut down the experiment after 6 days because his college student guards became so sadistic towards student prisoners. The Agoge was the Stanford prison experiment running continuously for 13 years with real stakes, real pain, and no ethical oversight committee to shut it down. Here's how the hierarchy actually functioned on a daily basis. The youngest boys, ages 7 to 10, are at the bottom. You have no power, no protection, no recourse. You exist to be commanded, corrected, and beaten. The middle tier, ages 11 to 14, have survived long enough to earn marginal status. They're still beaten by older boys, but now they're also encouraged to beat younger ones. This is the crucial transitional phase where victims begin practicing perpetration. The upper tier, ages 15 to 17, have significant authority over everyone below them. They're still technically students, still subject to the paidonomos, but within the peer hierarchy, they're enforcers. And then the Irenes, 18 to 20, are the elite. They've completed the basic Agoge. They're waiting to enter full citizenship and military service. And for these 2 years, they're given license to terrorize everyone below them. The brilliance, if we can use such a perverted word, is that the system maintains itself without adult intervention. The paidonomos doesn't need to personally beat every boy every day. He's created a structure where the boys do it to each other. He just watches and occasionally beats someone to remind everyone who ultimately holds power. Think about what this does to your developing brain. At 9 years old, you're learning that strength means the ability to inflict pain. That authority is measured by how much others fear you, that the world is divided into those who hurt and those who are hurt, and your only choice is which category you want to be in. You're learning that kindness is weakness, that mercy is foolishness, that the boy who shows compassion today will be the boy getting beaten tomorrow for being soft, and you're learning to dissociate, to separate your actions from your conscience, to tell yourself that when you're beating a younger boy in a few years, it won't be cruelty, it'll be education. Just like the boys beating you now aren't being cruel, they're preparing you. The rationalization becomes armor. Without it, you'd have to confront what's actually happening. With it, you can participate in the horror and tell yourself it's necessary. Some boys internalize this faster than others. There's always 1 or 2 in each age cohort who take to the role of abuser with enthusiasm. They're the ones who beat harder, who invent new punishments, who seem to enjoy it. Whether they were naturally predisposed to sadism or whether the system created it in them is impossible to know. But the system identifies them, rewards them, and eventually puts them in positions of maximum authority. These are the boys who become the next generation of paidonomoi. But the beating wasn't confined to random punishments and daily corrections. The Spartans formalized it, made it entertainment, the fighting pits. Several times per week, boys of roughly equal age and size were forced to fight each other while adult Spartans watched. These weren't training exercises, they weren't teaching technique or strategy. They were gladiatorial combat for children. No protective gear, no rules against hitting certain areas, no stoppage when someone was injured. You fought until someone couldn't continue or until the overseers decided they'd seen enough. Broken bones were common. Xenophon mentions this almost casually in his description of Spartan education, as if it were unremarkable that children regularly suffered fractures during these fights. And here's the part that reveals the true purpose. There was no medical care afterward. You broke your arm in a fight? You set it yourself, or got another boy to help? You suffered a concussion? You dealt with it. The philosophy was explicit. Learning to endure injury without complaint was part of the training. Modern medical understanding makes this even more horrifying. Untreated fractures in growing children can cause permanent deformities. Repeated head trauma during developmental years causes lasting cognitive damage. We know this now. The Spartans didn't care. But the physical damage wasn't the worst part. The psychological impact of being forced to brutalize your peers, boys you sleep next to, train alongside, steal food with, that's what leaves permanent scars. You're 10 years old. Your best friend, the boy who helped you steal bread last week, is across from you in the pit. And you're ordered to hurt him. Not spar with him. Hurt him. If you refuse, you're both beaten by the Irenes. If you hold back, you're beaten for cowardice. The only way to avoid punishment is to genuinely try to harm your friend. So you do. You throw real punches. You grapple with intent to injure. And when you win, when you're standing over his bleeding face, the adults cheer. What does that do to a child's capacity for empathy? It destroys it. Methodically, systematically. By forcing you to perform violence against people you care about, the system teaches you that caring itself is the problem. The solution is to stop caring, to view everyone, even allies, as potential opponents. Boys who cried after hurting their friends were beaten for weakness. Boys who refused to fight were starved. Boys who fought half-heartedly were punished for cowardice. The only acceptable response was to fight with full commitment and show no emotion about the outcome. Over years, this created men who could watch their comrades die in battle without flinching. Not because they were brave, but because their capacity for emotional response had been beaten out of them before puberty. And then there was the sexual component. This is where modern historians get squeamish, where textbooks use euphemisms like mentorship and educational relationships, where translations soften the language of primary sources to make it more palatable. But Plutarch and Xenophon describe it clearly. The Spartans practiced institutionalized pederasty, sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, as part of the educational system. The Greek term was paiderastia. The roles were erastes, the lover, an adult male, and eromenos, the beloved, a boy aged roughly 12 to 17. This wasn't unique to Sparta. Athens and other Greek city-states had similar practices, but the Spartan version was distinct in its militarization and coercion. Here's how it worked. When you reached 12 or 13, you were assigned an erastes, an adult Spartan warrior, usually in his 20s or 30s. This was presented as an honor. Your erastes would mentor you, teach you military skills, protect you within the hierarchy. The reality was exploitation dressed as education. Xenophon tries to sanitize it in his account, claiming that in Sparta, unlike other Greek cities, the relationships were purely platonic and educational. But Plutarch is more honest. He describes physical relationships between erastai and their eromenoi as expected and normalized. Modern scholars debate the exact nature and extent of sexual activity in these relationships. Some argue it was less sexualized than Athenian pederasty. Others point out that Plutarch explicitly mentions sexual elements and that Xenophon's denial reads like propaganda. What's not debatable is the power dynamic. You're 13 years old. A grown man, a warrior with full citizenship and authority, selects you. You don't get to refuse. If you're honored with his attention, rejecting it would be an insult that could have serious consequences. The relationship is framed as educational, but the Erastes has near total authority over you. He can dictate your activities, punish you, reward you, and expect obedience in all things. Even if we accept the most generous interpretation that not all of these relationships were sexual, the structure itself is abusive. An adult in a position of total power over a child, in a system that's already normalized violence and submission, adding intimate emotional and potentially physical relationships. This is grooming. By modern definition and understanding, this is institutional child sexual abuse. And the system had a rationalization for it. The Erastes was supposed to feel shame if his Eromenos showed cowardice or weakness. This would motivate him to train the boy harder, to ensure he became a worthy warrior. The Eromenos, in turn, was supposed to strive for excellence to honor his Erastes. It sounds almost noble when explained that way. Until you remember that the boy is 12 and has no power to refuse anything demanded of him. Plutarch records an incident where a boy cried out during training. His Erastes was publicly punished, not the boy, but the adult, for failing to properly educate his Eromenos to suppress emotion. This reveals the twisted logic. The boy's behavior reflected on the man, so the man had extra motivation to control the boy completely. Every aspect of your personality, your emotional responses, your behaviors, all of it was monitored and corrected by an adult who had total authority over you and a personal stake in molding you into something that met Spartan standards. The psychological term is complex trauma. When abuse comes from multiple sources simultaneously, physical violence from peers and supervisors, emotional manipulation from authority figures, sexual exploitation from mentors, all within a system you cannot escape, it fractures identity. You can't develop a stable sense of self because everything about you is being actively shaped by external forces, using pain as the primary teaching tool. Some boys form genuine emotional attachments to their Erastai. This wasn't unusual. Hostages bond with captors, abuse victims attach to abusers. It's a survival mechanism called trauma bonding. But those attachments didn't protect you. Sometimes they made it worse because now you had emotional investment in pleasing someone who might be hurting you. Let's talk about the clothing deprivation, because it seems minor compared to everything else, but it's a perfect example of how the Agoge weaponized every aspect of daily life. Remember, 1 cloak per year. That's your entire wardrobe. In summer, when temperatures in southern Greece regularly exceed 95 Fahrenheit, 35 Fahrenheit, you're wearing heavy wool. In winter, when mountain temperatures drop below freezing, you're wearing that same thin, worn cloak. No tunic underneath, no undergarments, no shoes. Plutarch explains the reasoning. Exposure to the elements would harden boys, make them tough, teach them to endure discomfort. But there's another effect he doesn't mention, probably because it was too obvious. Vulnerability. When you're inadequately clothed, you're constantly aware of your physical exposure. You're cold more often than you're warm. You're uncomfortable more often than you're comfortable. Your body is visible and accessible in ways that increase your sense of powerlessness. This is a control technique. Prisoners, slaves, people in institutional settings are often kept inadequately clothed specifically to increase compliance and reduce resistance. It's harder to rebel when you're shivering. And there's the sexual component again. Adolescent boys going through puberty inadequately clothed in close quarters with adult men who have authority over them and potentially sexual interest in them. The sleeping arrangements compounded this. You slept on beds you made yourself from reeds gathered from the Eurotas River. These weren't mattresses. They were rough pallets that provided minimal cushioning and no warmth. In winter, boys were allowed to add thistledown to their reed beds. This was presented as a privilege, a concession to comfort. Think about that. Adding some plant fluff to your bed of reeds was considered a luxury worth granting. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. People died from exposure. Plutarch doesn't give numbers, but he mentions that boys who couldn't endure the elements were considered weak. Considered weak is ancient Greek for probably died and nobody cared. So let's take inventory of your life at age 14, about 7 years into the Agoge. You were taken from your mother at 7. You've spent 7 years in systematic deprivation, hunger, cold, exhaustion. You've been beaten hundreds of times for infractions ranging from serious to trivial to non-existent. You've been forced to fight your peers until bones broke. You've learned to steal to survive and to feel no guilt about it. You've been placed in a hierarchy where you're both victim and perpetrator, beaten by older boys while learning to beat younger ones. You've watched boys die from beatings, exposure, starvation, or in the fighting pits, and you've learned not to react. You may have been sexually exploited by an adult mentor, or at minimum placed in a coercive relationship with massive power imbalance. You sleep on reeds in a room with 60 other traumatized boys. You wear one piece of clothing. You're still chronically hungry. And you're learning, day by day, that violence is the only reliable form of communication. That power is measured by capacity to inflict pain, and that weakness, physical or emotional, is unforgivable. What kind of person does this create? Not a healthy one, not a functional one, not someone capable of normal human relationships or emotional regulation or moral reasoning. What kind of person does this create? Not a healthy one, not a functional one, not someone capable of normal human relationships or emotional regulation or moral reasoning. But here's what the Spartans would tell you: you're not supposed to be a person, you're supposed to be a weapon. And weapons don't need empathy. They need to be sharp, hard, and completely obedient to the hand that wields them. You're 14 years old, and you're almost there. Almost fully forged. Just 6 more years. 6 more years of the same grinding horror. And then, if you survive, if you don't break completely, you get to face the final test. The one historians whisper about. The one that transforms victims into murderers. The one that proves the Agoge wasn't training warriors, it was creating state-sanctioned terrorists. At age 20, you'll enter the crypteia, and you'll learn exactly what all this suffering was actually for. You're 20 years old, you've survived 13 years of the Agoge, you're standing in front of the ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who govern Sparta, and they're giving you your final test. They hand you a knife. That's it. One knife. Then they give you your orders. Go into the countryside, hunt helots, kill the strongest, the smartest, the ones who might become leaders. Do this alone. Survive on what you can steal or kill. If you're caught, you're not a Spartan citizen, you're a criminal, and the helots can kill you with no consequences. If you fail to kill, you're not worthy of citizenship. If you succeed, you become a full Spartan warrior. This isn't a training exercise. This isn't a metaphor. This is state-mandated murder of unarmed civilians. Welcome to the crypteia. The word comes from cryptos, hidden or secret. It's the secret service, the shadow operation, the part of Spartan society they didn't advertise to visitors. And it's the moment when everything, all 13 years of systematic abuse, finally reveals its true purpose. Plutarch tries to soften it in his biography of Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver. He describes the crypteia as a difficult and harsh practice where young men were sent into the countryside to live rough. He mentions that they killed helots from time to time, and emphasizes it happened at night. But Plutarch was writing for a Roman audience centuries after Sparta's peak, and even he can't fully hide what this was. Read between his careful diplomatic language, and here's what emerges. 20-year-old men, fresh from the Agoge, were sent into helot territories with weapons. They hid during the day. At night, they emerged and killed helots, specifically targeting the physically strong and mentally capable ones. They did this for weeks or months. It was considered part of completing their education. Aristotle is more direct. In his Politics, he condemns the crypteia as unjust and brutal, a practice that reveals Sparta's fundamental moral corruption. Thucydides references the crypteia as an ongoing institution, not a rare occurrence. He mentions an incident where the Spartans promised freedom to 2,000 helots who had distinguished themselves in military service, then systematically murdered all of them. The crypteia carried out the killings. 2,000 people, promised freedom, then hunted down and killed by the Spartan secret police. This wasn't an aberration. This was how Sparta functioned. To understand why the crypteia existed, you need to understand what the helots were. They weren't slaves in the way we typically think of ancient slavery, purchased foreigners from distant lands. They were conquered peoples, primarily Messenians and some other local populations. Sparta had conquered them centuries earlier and turned them into a permanent underclass of agricultural workers, and they massively outnumbered the Spartans. Conservative estimates put the ratio at 7 helots for every Spartan citizen. Some historians suggest it was higher, 10 to 1, maybe more. Think about that. You're a Spartan, you're the elite, you own the land, make the laws, control the military, and you're surrounded by people you've enslaved who outnumber you 7 to 1 or more. Those people farm your land, prepare your food, build your buildings, do all the labor that allows you to spend your entire adult life training for war. And they hate you. Obviously. You've enslaved them, brutalized them, denied them basic human rights for generations. So how do you control a population that outnumbers you, hates you, and would absolutely rise up and murder you if they thought they could win? Terror. Systematic, unrelenting, unpredictable terror. Every year, the Spartan ephors formally declared war on the helots. Not metaphorical war, actual legal war. This made killing helots legally permissible. No trial necessary, no charges. A Spartan could kill a helot and face no consequences because technically you were at war. This annual declaration wasn't symbolic. It was the legal framework that made the crypteia possible. The crypteia operated year-round, not just when 20-year-olds were being tested. It was a permanent secret police force that hunted helots continuously. Young men completing the Agoge were rotated into this force as part of their final training. The logic was explicitly stated in ancient sources. Kill the strong ones before they can organize resistance. Eliminate potential leaders. Keep the helot population in a state of perpetual fear so they never dare to rebel. It's ethnic cleansing, systematized, legalized, operating continuously for centuries, and this is what 13 years of the Agoge was preparing you for. Imagine you're that 20-year-old now, you've been given your knife and your orders, you make your way to helot territory. Maybe it's farmland in Messenia, maybe it's villages in the countryside surrounding Sparta. You find a place to hide during the day, a cave, thick brush, anywhere you won't be spotted. You're alone, actually alone, for the first time since you were 7 years old. No Paidonomos, no Irenes, no barracks full of other boys. Just you, a knife, and your orders. At night, you emerge. You're hunting human beings, people who are farming, sleeping, living their lives. They're not warriors. They're not armed. They're agricultural workers, families, people trying to survive under a system that's enslaved them. Your job is to identify the strong ones, the smart ones, the ones who look like they might have leadership potential, and kill them. Maybe you observe a village for days. Maybe you identify a helot who seems respected by others, who organizes the work, who speaks up. That's your target. You wait until they're isolated. Then you attack. Some accounts suggest the kills were meant to look like accidents or raids by outsiders. Other sources indicate the Spartans didn't care if helots knew it was the crypteia. The fear was part of the point. You kill your first person, not in battle, not in a fair fight. You murder an unarmed civilian whose only crime was being born into the wrong population group. Then you hide the body or leave it as a warning depending on orders, and you do it again and again. For weeks or months you hunt and kill helots. What does this do to a person? Actually, that's the wrong question. What does this do to a person who's already been systematically abused for 13 years? It completes the psychological destruction. You've been taught since age 7 that violence is normal, that pain is educational, that strength means the capacity to inflict suffering. You've been starved, beaten, forced to hurt your peers. You've had empathy beaten out of you and replaced with rigid obedience. Now you're being told, all of that was preparation for this. Your purpose is to be the enforcer of an ethnic hierarchy. Your value to the state is your willingness to murder people based on their status as an conquered group. And if you refuse, you don't become a Spartan citizen. You don't get the social status you've suffered 13 years to earn. You become a tresance, a trembler, a coward, and spend the rest of your life as a humiliated outcast. So you don't refuse. Some young men probably killed efficiently, mechanically, doing what they'd been programmed to do. Some might have felt guilt initially, then suppressed it using the dissociation techniques they'd learned in the Agoge. Some might have even enjoyed it. 13 years of being victimized finally giving way to a position of power where they could inflict pain on others. Whatever you felt, you buried it. Because feeling was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. You completed your kills. You returned to Sparta. You reported to the ephors, and if you'd succeeded, you became a full citizen, a Spartan warrior, the product the Agoge was designed to create. So let's close the loop on the question that's been building since the beginning. Why? Why design such a brutal system? The answer that history textbooks give you is, to create superior warriors. That's a lie. Or at minimum, a massive oversimplification that misses the actual purpose. The Agoge wasn't designed to create warriors in the general sense. It was designed to create enforcers for an apartheid state. Sparta's entire society was built on the subjugation of helots. The Spartans, full citizens, were maybe 10 to 15% of the total population under their control. They produced nothing. They didn't farm, build, manufacture, or trade. All of that was done by helots and perioikoi, neighbors who weren't full citizens but weren't enslaved either. Full Spartan citizens did one thing: war. Constant, perpetual readiness for war. Why? Not to conquer new territories. Sparta was notoriously bad at expansion compared to other Greek states. They fought to maintain control over the population they'd already subjugated. The helots outnumbered them massively. The helots did all the real work. If the helots ever successfully revolted, Sparta would cease to exist overnight. So how do you maintain this system? How do you keep a vast enslaved population obedient when you're outnumbered and you've given them every reason to hate you? You create a class of men who are psychologically capable of extreme violence without moral hesitation. Men who view certain categories of humans as inherently inferior and therefore acceptable targets. Men who have been so thoroughly brutalized that they'll brutalize others without question. You create men who can hunt children, watch their peers die, and feel nothing. Men who can murder unarmed civilians and sleep soundly. Men who will follow orders no matter how horrific because disobedience is literally unthinkable. The Agoge created exactly that. Every element we've discussed, the starvation, the beatings, the hierarchy of abuse, the forced violence against peers, the sexual exploitation, the sleep deprivation, the exposure to elements, all of it served one purpose: destroy the child's capacity for independent moral reasoning and replace it with absolute obedience to state authority. The Crypteia was the final exam. It proved you were capable of murder on command. It proved you valued Spartan citizenship more than human life. It proved 13 years of programming had worked. Modern psychology has extensively studied how ordinary people can be trained to commit atrocities. The research on genocide perpetrators, on soldiers who commit war crimes, on guards in concentration camps, it all points to the same mechanisms: dehumanization of the target group, graduated escalation of violence, group pressure and compliance, authority legitimization, and punishment for disobedience. The Agoge incorporated all of these, refined them, and applied them for 13 formative years. Nazi Germany looked to Sparta as a model, not coincidentally. The SS training incorporated elements deliberately inspired by the Agoge. The Hitler Youth programs borrowed Spartan rhetoric about hardship building strength. They recognized what the Agoge actually was: a system for creating fanatics capable of maintaining a racial hierarchy through systematic violence. But not everyone completed the system. Not everyone became a full Spartan warrior. Some broke. They were called tresants, tremblers. The word itself is contempt. Men who showed cowardice in battle, or who failed to complete the Agoge, or who somehow revealed themselves as weak. The punishment for being a tresants was worse than death. You were marked, literally. You had to shave half your beard, a visible sign of your failure. You wore distinct clothing so everyone could identify you as a coward. You were forbidden from marriage. You couldn't participate in the syssitia, communal meals. You couldn't hold any political office. Other Spartans were encouraged to insult you, strike you in public, humiliate you openly, and you couldn't fight back. If you defended yourself, you'd be punished further. You became a living warning. This is what happens when you fail to meet Spartan standards. Some tresants committed suicide. Others lived in perpetual humiliation. Plutarch mentions that some of the most brutal Spartans were men who'd been labeled cowards and were overcompensating, trying desperately to prove they weren't weak. The system created its own enforcement mechanism. The threat of becoming a tresants was so horrific that boys would endure almost anything to avoid it. And here's the cruelest part. There was no clear standard for what made you a tresantes. It could be failing in battle, but battles were unpredictable. It could be showing fear at the wrong moment, but you had no control over involuntary responses. It could be making the wrong person angry. Politics played a role. You could survive 13 years of the Agoge and still end up marked as a failure based on one moment, one decision, one perceived weakness. This created perpetual anxiety. You were never safe. You could never truly relax into having made it because Spartan society could revoke your status at any time. There are almost no documented cases of successful resistance to the system from within. A few boys tried to escape. Virtually none succeeded. Sparta was geographically isolated by mountains, surrounded by territories where runaways would be recognized and returned. And the punishment for attempted escape was severe: torture, often death. A few adult Spartans questioned the system. They were exiled or killed. Dissent was treason. The Helots revolted multiple times over Spartan history. The most significant was the Third Messenian War, when a devastating earthquake gave the Helots an opportunity. They nearly succeeded in overthrowing Spartan rule. The Spartan response was predictable: brutal suppression, mass killings, and escalated terror. The Cryptia operated in overdrive. Thousands of Helots were murdered. This was the Spartans' greatest fear, the nightmare that justified the entire system. If the Helots ever organized effectively, if they ever overcame their fear, Sparta would fall. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. But we'll get to that. For now, understand this. The Agoge wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a few bad leaders making harsh decisions. It was the foundation of Spartan civilization. Everything Sparta was, its military reputation, its social structure, its famous discipline, rested on systematic child abuse in service of maintaining ethnic subjugation. You've spent 13 years being tortured. You've murdered civilians to prove your worth. You're 20 years old and you've never known a day without violence. And now, finally, you're a full Spartan citizen. Congratulations, you're exactly what the system designed you to be. But here's the question nobody was asking, the one that should have been obvious from the beginning. Does this actually work? Does traumatizing children for 13 years create effective warriors? Does systematic abuse produce a sustainable society? The answer came over the next few centuries, and it revealed that the Agoge's greatest failure wasn't moral, it was practical. The system that supposedly created invincible warriors actually created something far more fragile than anyone realized, and when it finally broke, it broke completely. So what did 13 years of systematic torture actually produce? The answer isn't what Sparta promised. The Agoge didn't create superior warriors, it created men who were psychologically incapable of adaptation. They were obedient, yes, fearless about death, absolutely, willing to stand in formation and die without breaking, proven repeatedly, but they were also rigid, strategically inflexible, and completely unable to think creatively when circumstances changed. Perfect for one type of warfare, the phalanx. Stand in tight formation, shield locked to shield, spear forward, and advance or hold ground. It required discipline, courage, and the ability to suppress self-preservation instincts. The Agoge trained men to do exactly this, but warfare evolved, and Sparta couldn't. The famous Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, the one the movie 300 mythologized, involved 300 Spartans, yes. It also involved 700 Thespians, several hundred Thebans, and thousands of other Greek allies who fought and died there. The Spartans made up less than 5% of the Greek force. History remembers the 300. It forgets the 7,000 others. Why? Because Sparta had the best propaganda. They understood that reputation was a weapon. The myth of invincibility was almost as useful as actual military superiority. But look at their actual military record. It's mixed at best. They won battles when the enemy fought their way, traditional hoplite warfare, phalanx against phalanx. They lost when faced with innovation. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas deployed an unconventional tactic. He weighted one wing of his phalanx much more heavily than standard formation. The Spartans, trained to respond to traditional deployment, couldn't adapt quickly enough. They were routed, decisively. About 400 Spartan citizens died in a single afternoon, a catastrophic loss for a population that had already dwindled to dangerous levels. And here's the critical point. After Leuctra, Spartan military supremacy ended. Forever. One battle, one innovative tactic they couldn't counter, and centuries of reputation shattered. Why couldn't they adapt? Because the Agoge created men who followed patterns, not men who thought creatively. It beat independent thinking out of them. It punished questioning. It rewarded rigid adherence to established methods. When warfare required flexibility, strategic innovation, or tactical creativity, Spartans failed. But military defeat wasn't Sparta's real problem. The real problem was demographic collapse. At Sparta's peak, around 480 BCE, there were maybe 8,000 full Spartan citizens, adult males who'd completed the Agoge and held full political rights. By 371 BCE, there were fewer than 1,000. The Agoge killed boys. Some died from beatings, some from exposure, some from starvation, some from the fighting pits, some broke psychologically and were cast out as tresants. The survival rate was never 100%, and Sparta refused to grant citizenship to anyone who hadn't completed the system. They had perioikoi, neighbors who lived in Spartan territory but weren't full citizens. They had helots, enslaved peoples. Both groups vastly outnumbered Spartans, but Sparta's rigid social hierarchy wouldn't allow them to replenish citizen ranks from these populations, so the citizen population shrank. Generation after generation, fewer boys survived to become men. Fewer men produced the next generation of boys. Constant warfare killed more. Spartan warriors died in battle at high rates, partly because their tactical inflexibility got them killed, partly because they'd been trained to view death as preferable to retreat. The system was eating itself. By the time Leuctra happened, Sparta couldn't afford to lose 400 citizens. That was nearly half their remaining military-age male population. After Leuctra, they never recovered. Other Greek states, recognizing Spartan weakness, invaded. The Helots in Messenia, liberated by Theban intervention, established their own independent state. Sparta's economic foundation, Helot labor, vanished. Within a generation, Sparta became a second-rate power. Within a century, it was effectively irrelevant. And what about the men the system produced? The ones who survived? Ancient sources give us glimpses of what Spartan warriors were like after military age, and it's not pretty. there were high rates of what we'd now recognize as PTSD and difficulty forming normal relationships. Emotional unavailability was so severe it was remarked upon even by other Greeks, who weren't exactly known for emotional openness. These were men who'd been abused from age 7 to 20, then spent their 20s and 30s killing, then... What? The Spartans had no answer. Their society had no role for men who aged out of active warfare except to participate in governance and continue the system by abusing the next generation. The result was a population of traumatized men who'd never learned to be anything except weapons, trying to function in a society that had no use for them once they dulled. Spartan women, by contrast, had unusual freedom for the ancient world. They could own property, manage estates, and make economic decisions because the men were completely non-functional in domestic life. Men who'd spent 13 years learning that violence was the only valid response to problems don't make good household managers. Women ran the economy by necessity, but Spartan women also participated in the system. Mothers who showed grief when their 7-year-old sons were taken were punished. Mothers were expected to tell their sons returning from battle, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning win or die, but don't retreat. The whole society was structured around perpetuating the trauma cycle. Here's the final irony. If Sparta's system worked, if the Agoge really did create a superior society, why did Sparta collapse completely while Athens, which educated children through philosophy, art, and debate, shaped Western civilization for 250 years? Athens produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, and Euripides. They gave us democratic governance, philosophy, mathematics, and architecture that still influences modern building. Sparta produced military tactics and a cautionary tale about what happens when a society mistakes cruelty for strength. By the Roman period, Sparta was essentially a tourist attraction. Romans would visit to watch reenactments of ancient Spartan rituals, including the whipping ceremony at Artemis Orthia's altar. Boys were still whipped for Roman entertainment. The great warrior culture had become a theme park. Modern military academies that cite Spartan discipline conveniently ignore the child abuse, the ethnic cleansing, and the systematic psychological destruction. They take the aesthetics, the toughness, the endurance, the camaraderie, while pretending the foundation wasn't torture. But you can't separate them. The discipline came from breaking children. The endurance came from systematic trauma. The camaraderie came from shared suffering in a system designed to destroy individual identity. Every attempt to recreate Spartan values without acknowledging this ends up either watering down the system until it bears no resemblance to the original, or recreating the abuse and calling it character building. Nazi Germany understood this. They explicitly modeled aspects of SS training on the Agoge. They recognized it for what it was, a system for creating fanatics willing to commit atrocities without moral hesitation. That's Sparta's real legacy. So after 250 years, what's the actual verdict on Sparta's grand experiment in human engineering? Let's start with the historical verdict. Sparta existed as a major power for roughly 400 years. Athens shaped Western civilization for over 250 years and counting. Democracy, philosophy, science, art, literature, theatre. The foundations of modern thought trace back to Athens. What does Sparta give us? A word that means austere and a cautionary tale about mistaking brutality for strength. When you visit Greece today, you see the Parthenon, the ancient theatres, the philosophical academies. Sparta? There are barely any ruins. They built almost nothing of lasting value. No great architecture, no philosophical works, no scientific discoveries, no art that survived because they created almost none. Their contribution to human civilization was perfecting the phalanx formation and demonstrating that you can torture children into obedience. That's the legacy. The psychological verdict is even clearer. Modern psychology has definitively proven what should have been obvious. You cannot torture people into mental health. You cannot abuse children into becoming functional adults. Trauma doesn't build character. It fractures it. The Agoge worked only if your definition of success is creating traumatized enforcers for an apartheid state. It succeeded at producing men who could stand in formation and die without flinching. It succeeded at creating people capable of hunting and killing civilians without moral qualms. But it failed at everything else. It failed to create strategic thinkers. It failed to produce a sustainable population. It failed to build a society that could adapt to changing circumstances. It failed to create men capable of anything except violence and obedience. Every longitudinal study of childhood trauma confirms this. Children subjected to systematic abuse develop PTSD, attachment disorders, emotional regulation problems, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The severity of outcomes correlates directly with the duration and intensity of abuse. The Agoge was maximum intensity for 13 years during the most crucial developmental period. The fact that it produced psychologically destroyed adults isn't surprising. It would be surprising if it hadn't. The moral verdict is the simplest of all. There is no historical context that excuses systematic child abuse. None. The ancient Greeks themselves, Aristotle, Plutarch, and others, condemned Spartan practices. This wasn't normal even for the ancient world. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and other Greek city-states all trained warriors. None of them required tearing 7-year-olds from their families and subjecting them to 13 years of institutionalized torture. None of them made child murder part of graduation requirements. Sparta was an outlier, an extremist society that even its contemporaries recognized as brutal and morally bankrupt. And yet, 250 years later, we're still romanticizing them. We make movies like 300 that turn the Battle of Thermopylae into heroic fantasy while completely ignoring what created those warriors. We use Spartan as a positive descriptor, Spartan discipline, Spartan dedication, Spartan toughness, as if these qualities existed independently of the abuse that produced them. We do this because the myth is seductive. The idea that suffering builds character, that hardship creates strength, that brutality produces excellence. It's appealing in its simplicity. It's also completely wrong. The Spartans themselves proved it wrong. Their system collapsed. Their warriors lost. Their society contributed nothing lasting except a warning about what happens when you mistake cruelty for virtue. But why does this matter now? Why spend 12,000 words examining an ancient civilization that collapsed 230 years ago? Because we keep trying to recreate it. Military hazing rituals that kill recruits. Tough love. Wilderness boot camps for troubled teens where children die from abuse and neglect. Sports coaches who justify psychological torture as building champions. Authoritarian regimes that claim harsh treatment create strong citizens. Every generation produces people who look at Sparta and think they were onto something. They weren't. They discovered that if you systematically traumatize children, you can create obedient adults who don't question authority. That's not a revelation, it's a war crime. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by almost every nation on Earth, explicitly prohibits the practices we've described. Forcible separation from families, systematic starvation, physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and exposure to life-threatening conditions. All of it is recognized as child abuse under international law. We know better now. We have the science, the psychology, and the historical evidence. We know that trauma doesn't build character, it destroys it. We know that abuse creates more abuse. We know that societies built on systematic violence eventually collapse under the weight of their own cruelty. And yet the myth persists. Let's go back to that boy we opened with. The 12-year-old being whipped at Artemis Orthia's altar, blood running down his back, face locked in silent agony. He survived that beating. He survived the rest of the Agoge. He killed during the Crypteia. He became a full Spartan citizen. He stood in the phalanx, fought in multiple battles, watched his comrades die, and probably died himself in some forgotten skirmish defending a system that had destroyed him at age 7. His name wasn't recorded. History didn't preserve it. He was a product, not a person. A weapon forged from a child's suffering. And Sparta called this strength. But here's what they couldn't see, what we can see clearly from 450 of distance. Strength isn't the ability to endure suffering. It's the ability to prevent unnecessary suffering. Courage isn't dying without question. It's questioning systems that demand pointless deaths. Discipline isn't blind obedience. It's the self-control to act according to principles rather than programming. The Agoge created none of these things. It created obedient, traumatized men who confused their own destruction with virtue. The real lesson of Sparta isn't about what creates great warriors. It's about what destroys human societies. When you build civilization on systematic abuse, you're building on a foundation that cannot hold. When you mistake cruelty for strength, you guarantee your own collapse. When you sacrifice children to maintain systems of oppression, you've already lost everything worth preserving. Sparta fell because the Agoge didn't create strength. It created fragility disguised as hardness, brittleness disguised as toughness, psychological destruction disguised as discipline, and 250 years later, the verdict is clear. The Agoge was exactly what it appeared to be: child abuse systematized, trauma weaponized, humanity destroyed in the name of the state. We spent centuries trying to make that sound noble. It never was. When someone calls you a Spartan warrior as a compliment, maybe don't take it as one. When a system claims suffering builds character, ask what kind of character it builds. When anyone argues that brutality produces excellence, point them to Sparta and show them the ruins.